Hey guys, tonight we will explore the tomb of Queen Elizabeth I, deep within the vault of Westminster Abbey, where a lead coffin has lain undisturbed for centuries, hiding secrets that will chill your blood. Picture flickering candlelight, illuminating every crack in the stone vault. The sickly tang of dried blood mingling with thick incense smoke, and the faint rattle of phantom bones echoing in the darkness. What lies within that coffin is enough to make even the most seasoned historians recoil. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And don't forget to leave a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is there now. Dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. In the gloomy darkness of the royal vault at Westminster Abbey, a perfectly preserved lead coffin has lain undisturbed for centuries, concealing secrets that make even the most hardened historians shudder. When investigators finally drilled through the stone floor of the abbey, they discovered the remains of Elizabeth I, the legendary Virgin Queen of England, distorted beyond recognition. Elizabeth Alexandra Mary Tudor, born on the 29th of September in the year 1533, was the daughter of King Henry VIII and his second wife, Princess Anne Boleyn. She was the granddaughter of King Henry VII on her father's side, and Queen Elizabeth of York on her father's mother's side, and the granddaughter of Robert Boleyn, Earl of Ormond, and Lady Elizabeth Howard on her mother's side. In her immediate family, Elizabeth had one younger brother, Prince Edward, and one elder sister, Mary, who reigned as Mary I before Elizabeth succeeded to the throne. At the tender age of 9, Elizabeth witnessed the tragic downfall of her mother, Anne Boleyn, who was beheaded, an event that nearly cost the young princess her own standing. At 16 years of age, she was created Princess of Wales in a grand ceremony, only to fall under royal suspicion not long afterward. Nevertheless, on the 15th of January, in the year 1601, following the death of her sister Mary I, Elizabeth was proclaimed Queen of England at the age of 26. Her reign lasted a full 45 years, until her death in March of the year 1603. During that time, she left countless marks on history. She firmly established Protestantism, defeated the Spanish Armada in the year 1588, strengthened the power of Parliament, and patronized the flourishing of arts and sciences, an era remembered as the Elizabethan Golden Age. Under her rule, trade and overseas exploration boomed, with fleets of English merchant ships venturing across the seas, laying the foundations for a future empire. Despite her great achievements, Elizabeth was not without her faults. She steadfastly refused to marry to preserve her reputation as the Virgin Queen, which led many to question her political motives. She signed the death warrant of Mary, Queen of Scots, her cousin deeming her a threat to the throne, a decision that sparked enduring controversy. She also ruthlessly suppressed Catholic factions, resulting in religious persecution of many subjects. Additionally, her heavy taxation policies and restrictions on peasants sometimes provoked unrest and social tension. Yet Elizabeth knew how to balance mercy with severity. She often delayed punishments and employed shrewd diplomacy to maintain internal peace. She was also a major patron of Shakespeare and many renowned artists of the Elizabethan era, providing a foundation for England's cultural renaissance. With her graceful presence and magnificent attire, Elizabeth carried within her a resolute heart. She deftly navigated political intrigues, preserving her monarchy without allowing any faction to dominate. Her portraits frequently depict the Armada portrait she crowned, scepter in hand, symbolizing victory and authority. Stories of her reign emphasize not only her naval triumphs, but also her tactful conduct and sharp intellect. She would read late into the night, pondering the realm's destiny, and instruct her council to deliberate carefully on every policy. This earned her the title Outstanding Queen of Europe, in the eyes of many foreign diplomats. Although she left the throne more than 4 centuries ago, Elizabeth's spirit still resonates. Her name appears in every study of the English Renaissance, from literature and architecture to diplomacy. Despite her flaws and controversies, her legacy remains a symbol of steadfast will and brilliant wisdom. And today, when one steps into the Westminster vault, all that former splendor seems to vanish. There, beneath the thick lead lining, the brutal secrets of death and embalming await those curious enough to uncover them. Yet in the stillness, one can almost hear the whispers of a queen who once conquered the seas and amazed all of Europe, now lying silent at the bottom of her tomb, a testament that, no matter how brilliant one's power, in the end, all must lie down. From the memories of glory and power, we now find ourselves in the solemn space where the Queen's body finally fell. As the whispers of a golden age gradually faded, Elizabeth I, after so many months of resisting exhaustion, at last collapsed on the morning of the 24th of March in the year 1603. In the hushed atmosphere of Richmond Palace, she finally gave way. Rather than lying down upon the velvet-draped bed, Elizabeth chose to lean against a support and stand for hours, summoning her strength at the brink of the ultimate farewell. The ladies-in-waiting whispered that the Queen must still be haunted by the image of her mother, Anne Boleyn, crammed crudely into an oak coffin only hours after the executioner's blade fell. That horror was etched into her final will. "My body must not be disturbed. It shall rest in its untouched state." Yet, no sooner had her last breath been drawn than the machinery of royal authority sprang to life without hesitation. The Lord Chamberlain, clad in sombre black ceremonial robes, raised his arm in a solemn signal, and the surgeon's team hurried to prepare their instruments. The surgical scalpel, sharp as a sword's edge, stood ready to slice through still warm flesh. Long, gleaming metal rods awaited insertion into the nasal passages to penetrate the skull and extract the brain. Curved iron hooks, cold and unfeeling, were poised to haul out intestines and organs, tools of the most brutal embalming rite of the medieval era. Against the backdrop of a silent painting of paradise, the dais for the envoys and the lute shelf still echoed with dirges, creating a scene both dignified and dread-soaked. Inside the apothecary room, adjacent to the wine chamber, where lutes still played, Elizabeth, though utterly spent, was carried in for her final audiences with the court. She listened in silence to the creaking strings, candlelight flickering to cast ghostly shadows upon the walls, her eyes wide as if seeing things unseen by others. With each agonized breath, she reminded herself that this was not yet the moment of release. Upon a cushioned chair, a lady-in-waiting quietly caught a tear that escaped from the Queen's eye. This, the second punctuation before the true journey would begin. When she at last surrendered her body, the room seemed to fall into stillness. The lute's melody faltered. The rattling of dry bones resonated longer. The scalpel was drawn from its leather sheath, followed by the clatter of metal implements and tearing flesh. The first incision beneath her ribcage rent the hush. There was the sweet-sour scent of fresh blood mingled with the acrid odor of surgical alcohol. Her heart, which had pounded for each political decree, was gently lifted by the chief surgeon for examination. The very source of her sovereign power now lay as a loose organ upon a steel tray. Next, the iron hook plunged in, and her intestines emerged like slimy ropes. One by one, her viscera were revealed under the cold gaze of the onlookers. The brain, the sacred seat of a dynasty's intellect, was pulverized by the slender metal rod forced in through both nostrils, its grey mass spilling onto the cold stone floor. They hurriedly poured vinegar and wine into the cavity before scooping the remains into copper jars to neutralize the foul stench. Through the haze of drowsy recollection, the scene still sends shivers down the spine. Attendants swiftly burned incense, smoky trails spreading through the chamber in a vain attempt to mask the horror. Beneath the dim candlelight, her skin displayed mottled sores, evidence of decades of lead-based makeup. revealing patches of necrosis. Her lips, sealed tight, dripped with serum, and the clinking of the iron hook against raw flesh sounded like a funeral drum. Her ribcage was pried open, leaving the thoracic cavity hollow once the organs were removed. The team cleansed the cavity with wine and vinegar, then packed it with crushed rosemary bark, frankincense, myrrh, and sawdust. A grotesque, festive feast for a royal corpse. Herbs and spices lay scattered about, exuding the scent of decaying majesty, a perfume of blood and death entwined. Finally, her abdomen was sewn shut with coarse thread, the stitching jagged and soiled with residual fluids. Her hollow eye sockets were rebuilt with beeswax, and a plaster mask was laid over her face, crafting the illusion of peaceful slumber. Atop her head, a crimson wig symbol of her fiery reign was carefully fastened. When the lead coffin lid was closed, her form might have appeared to rest. Yet if one listened closely, one could still hear the faint hiss of expanding metal and the breath of a corpse not yet at peace. Thus began the journey of Elizabeth's body from the pinnacle of power to the abyss of decay. A long voyage through an endless night. For those still awake, relax your spirit and follow the whispers of history. This journey has only just begun. As the layers of white lead powder and crimson rouge that once adorned Elizabeth's visage flaked away, a horrifying mask emerged in their place, skin shriveled like aged parchment, nostrils gaping into shadow-wed pits, lips twisted into a silent sneer, and teeth blackened and stumpy as rotting wooden pegs. Where once stood a regal posture, now lay a body bloated with dropsy, her limbs ballooned to grotesque proportions, each step requiring gentle support from trembling attendants who dared not let her fall. Yet even this ghastly sight paled beside the true terror of her final malady, the royal disease. A putrid abscess, festering in her throat so vile that Elizabeth could not swallow a single drop of water. Her mouth, once the instrument of stirring speeches and gracious smiles, had become a vessel of reeking decay. Dr. John Manningham, who stood vigil at her bedside, would record in later years that he had never witnessed such a desecration of power, a sovereign of all Europe imprisoned within her own rotting flesh. A horror surpassing any legend. Despite her explicit will forbidding interference with her corpse, the embalming process pressed on without mercy. The chamber was filled with the frenetic activity of preparatory rites. Yew-wood chests opened to reveal jars of every conceivable aromatic frankincense in crystalline chunks, powdered myrrh, crushed benzoin resin, bundles of dried herbs and grasses, all intended to shut the mouth of death and seal away the stench. Yet these fragrant offerings could mask the rot no more than a single candle can dispel the darkest night. The odour of putrefaction, sharp and insistent, lingered in the very air, a memento of mortality that would outlast the fading echoes of Elizabeth's whispered goodbyes. One physician, his hands gloved in coarse linen, poured mouldering frankincense into deep cavities in her torso. Another scattered powdered herbs, rosemary, lain, juniper into each incision, hoping the plant essences would neutralize the foulness. Yet the agents of decay were not so easily subdued. Every breath they drew seemed to carry the rancid perfume of a once majestic life dissolving from within. Hier swollen ankles, now, peeking from beneath the gown's hem, bore the marks of intravenous poultices applied in vain. Attendants worked with trembling precision, washing and rewrapping, layering cloth soaked in rosewater and vinegar, then packing dried rue and wormwood to keep the lingering juices at bay. The ritual was as much exorcism as it was preservation, a desperate attempt to hold back the tide of corruption, threatening to consume her completely. In corners of the chamber, the flicker of torchlight cast quivering shadows on carved oak panels that depicted angels tending the righteous dead, a stark contrast to the reality before them. Elizabeth's hollowed cheeks and leaking fluids seemed to mock those celestial visions. The incense smoke curled lazily in the gloom, but its sweetness was swallowed by the earthier, more tenacious stench of flesh giving way to the inexorable forces of entropy. Outside, the muffled strains of a solitary lute drifted in from the adjoining hall, a mournful melody that punctuated each laboured movement of the embalming team. Within, Elizabeth lay silent, her mind long departed, though her body writhed under the ministrations. Each insertion of a thistle needle to draw out excess fluid, each layer of spice-laden cloth tucked into her, seemed to drag her further from the realm of the living, even as it spared her from immediate collapse into dust. By candle 3 of the evening, the procession of specimens was complete jars of her liver, tinctures of her heart's fluids, bundles of drained fluids labelled by the court's apothecary. These relics, destined for separate interment or scholarly study, bore witness to a sovereignty utterly undone by its own attempts at triumphing over nature. Even the lords present, once poised for decorum, found themselves recoiling at the sight of their queen's ravaged remains. As the final folds of linen were secured, a hush fell upon the chamber. The grand tapestry behind her, once depicting the Tudor rose in full bloom, now framed a tableau of decay. The lead coffin lay open and ready, its dull surface reflecting the weary faces of those who had laboured through the ritual. One last handful of powdered herbs was thrown into the opening as a token of mercy, though none could quite believe it would quell the relentless march of rot. With measured solemnity, the coffin lid was lowered, the reverberation of metal against metal sounding like a distant, final bell. The chamber's head embalmer stepped back, his posture formal, though his eyes betrayed a lingering shudder. A soft chant rose as the attendants released a final cloud of incense into the enclosed space, the smoke pooling like spectral mist around the coffin's rim. And then, in the quiet that followed, there remained only the subtle hiss of vapour escaping from the seams, a reminder that even stone and lead yielded to the alchemy of decomposition. The great queen, once the embodiment of majesty and power, was now enshrined in a vessel of her own making, her body's last journey sealed behind a mask of wax and a shroud of herbs. The melody of the lute had faded, and those still awake felt the weight of history settle upon their shoulders like a tombstone. Thus concluded the grim rites of Elizabeth I's embalming, an elaborate dance with decay that blurred the line between reverence and horror. The Queen's physical form, once celebrated in portraits and poems, was cast into a new role, a lesson in the futility of resisting nature's sovereign decree. And as the torches guttered low, the attendants departed in solemn procession, leaving the coffin behind them, to lie in darkness until the day came for its final interment. When the order for embalming was given, the chief surgeon stepped forward, leading the apothecary team with their cold instruments arrayed on a polished tray, a curved scalpel for opening the abdomen, hooked metal probes for drawing out the intestines, a long iron rod destined for the nasal passages to penetrate the brain case, and buckets at the ready for collecting blood and bodily fluids. In the dim lamplight, each tool gleamed with grim intent. The first incisions were made beneath the sternum, the blade slicing through warm flesh and revealing layers of yellowed fat and sinewy muscle. A sigh of fetid air escaped with that initial cut, a mingled breath of decay, of forced spirit distilled by surgical alcohol, and of poorly rendered, rank sweet oils meant to hide the truth. One by one, the Queen's internal organs were extracted and laid out for inspection. Her heart, once firm and beat-driven by the pulse of state matters, now lay enlarged and spongy, its chambers thickened from years of dropsy. Her liver was plump with fatty degeneration, betraying a diet of lavish banquets. The lungs, mottled in dark and light patches, bore the stains of chronic illness, perhaps from the damp air of old palaces. As the apothecaries whispered speculations, was it poison? Or merely disease? The evidence lay plainly before them: fluid accumulation in her limbs, telltale residue of lead-based cosmetics, and even traces of mercury used to preserve her complexion had corroded her tissues from within. When the time came for the brain, The surgeon raised his rod and inserted it through one nostril. With a practiced tap, he guided it through the thin bone beneath the forehead. Fracturing the cranial floor, a riot of putrescent grey matter surged onto the floor in a slimy arc. The stench of rotting nerve tissue hit those present like a wave, and more than one assistant lurched forward, emptying their guts upon the cold stones. They hastily poured wine and vinegar over the residue, hoping the acidic fumes would quell the rising nausea. Then, methodically, they scooped the mixture into a small brass urn, sealing it for posterity and scientific curiosity. Next came the bathing of the hollowed-out corpse. Buckets of fortified wine and strong vinegar were dumped into the abdominal cavity, the liquid sluicing over every surface to cleanse away the last vestiges of decay. A rustle of dried herbs, myrrh, frankincense, saffron followed. The embalmers packed the cavity tightly with fragrant powders and sawdust. A macabre stuffing meant both to absorb remaining fluids and to impart a semblance of olfactory dignity. Each handful of spice spilled onto the tattered linings, sending soft waves of herbal smoke through the air. An attempt to choke off the sour reek of mortal dissolution. Once the cavity was filled, the surgeons set to work on the sealing process. Coarse linen thread was used to stitch the flank incision shut, the heavy stitches pulling skin taut over the herbal core. The seams gaped in places, oozing small droplets of residual fluid over her face. They applied a mask of beeswax and plaster, moulding it to mimic her regal features. The lips were tinted with a faint blush of vermilion pigment, a pale echo of the vibrant rouge she had once worn. Where once a vivacious smile had charmed foreign dignitaries, now only a waxen approximation remained, frozen in a half-forgotten expression. Finally, they laid a crimson wig upon her waxen brow, sealing the illusion of life's warmth within the dark vault. The lead coffin lid was ready to close, and a hush fell over the chamber. The chief surgeon, in a gesture of solemn finality, sprinkled a last pinch of powdered frankincense across the coffin's interior rim. The lid descended with a muffled thud, the dull metal reverberating like a distant, final drumbeat. In that moment, the Queen's physical transformation stood complete from sovereign, embodied in flesh and blood, to an effigy of cold wax and scented stuffing, a testament to human ingenuity's attempt to thwart natural decay. Outside, the corridors of the palace seemed unnaturally silent, as if in deference to the profound stillness now reigning within the coffin's space. For those few who witnessed the rite, the room's heavy air lingered with the remnants of spice and vinegar. The lute's mournful notes had long since faded, replaced by the soft echoes of departing footsteps. As they extinguished the final candles and withdrew into the corridors, the vault remained sealed, a closed chapter on both regal authority and the inexorable laws of mortality. It was an ending and a beginning the body laid to rest, while the story of its departure whispered on in the dark, lulling all who heard it into a drowsy contemplation of power, decay, and the quiet triumph of time. The embalmed body was then arrayed in full regalia, a sumptuous gown of silk and brocade, its colours muted by the dim torchlight, and a brilliant crimson wig crowned upon her waxen brow. She appeared at once both splendid and spectral, as though asleep in a dream woven from royal finery, carried upon the lead-lined coffin draped in deep purple velvet. The pageant wound its way through London's narrow streets, the scent of incense and candle wax mingling with an unmistakable undercurrent of decay. Villagers and city dwellers alike gathered along the route, tears glistening in their eyes as they waved handkerchiefs and bowed their heads. None suspected that beneath all that grandeur lay a veritable chemical battlefield. The prisoner that was her corpse continually exhaled a hissing breath, an unholy sigh colliding with the whisper of spring breezes. For the full span of 4 hours, the coffin trundled toward Westminster Abbey, the sun unseasonably warm for early spring pressing down upon its metallic shell. The rising temperature only accelerated the reactions within latent gases, swelled, and sought escape. carrying with them an aroma of rot too potent to wholly mask. Several times, the pallbearers paused, their robes billowing in agitation, and discreetly bored small holes into the coffin's sides. A soft PS sheet hiss followed each puncture, releasing a plume of vapour that was hastily sealed over before the congregation could notice. All the while, the purple velvet maintained its dignified guise, a lush banner draped over a churning engine of decay. At last, the procession reached the abbey. The heavy oak doors swung open to admit the coffin, and as it descended, step by step into the dark, vaulted crypt, a low crack echoed like the shattering of an ancient shield. The lead parted at a seam, releasing a tremor that ran up the pallbearer's arms and rippled through the assembled clergy. Within that narrow stone chamber lay the coffin of Mary I, Elizabeth's half-sister, for whom she had once harboured dread. Now, the two rivals were to rest side by side in eternal confinement, their mortal squabbles rendered moot by the vault's cold embrace. In the days that followed, the monks and vergers of Westminster Abbey reported strange sounds emanating from the royal vault. At times it was a soft creak, as though wood groaned under burden. At others, a faint tapping, suggestive of a desperate knock from within. Officially, these noises were attributed to rats, ever the subterranean culprits. Yet those who had stood witness to the coffin's insertion knew better. The sounds were the laboured pulse of metal contracting and flesh rebelling against its confines. The panicked gasps of fermentation trapped in chambers that should have been sanctified. Within the abbey's hushed corridors, the secret of what lay beneath remained tightly sealed. The vault was bolted and barred, the key entrusted only to a handful of senior clerics who swore oaths of silence. For centuries, the tale drifted into legend, whispered only in the darkest corners of the cloister, as scholars and pilgrims alike traversed the hallowed nave, oblivious to the living tomb beneath their feet. Meanwhile, the city above marched on, drawn by the promise of new markets and fresh gossip. The memory of the Queen's funeral attire, her regal visage forever frozen in wax, seeped into the collective consciousness as a solemn relic of a bygone age. Yet, unknown to most, the velvet-draped coffin continued its slow, ceaseless transformation far beneath the abbey's stones. The smells and sounds of decay persisted, cycling through hidden rituals of pressure and release. An underground symphony of chemical reaction playing out in darkness. Once, a solitary verger, plagued by insomnia, claimed he heard a soft chorus of hisses, accompanied by the scent of ancient spices. He confessed in a letter never to be made public that he felt a gentle weeping, a sound that tugged at his heart, whether he was awake or dreaming. His fellow colleagues admonished him for indulging in superstition, insisting that a candle's flicker had merely startled a loose shutter. But the verger, in the hush before dawn, knew he had heard the breath of two queens entwined, Elizabeth and Mary, bound together beyond life's enmities. As the decades passed, the vault's story grew distant, relegated to footnotes in dusty tomes. Yet those trained in the abbey's archives spoke of the sealed chamber with a reverence akin to fear. They recorded details, the purple stain that never faded, the residual thrum of occasional cracks, the persistent rumours of a phantom hiss. None dared remove the coffin, and the key was interred with the dean's own remains, ensuring that the twin coffins remained undisturbed. Thus, history's pages turned, and new monarchs rose and fell. The abbey itself underwent restorations and expansions, its soaring arches and stained glass windows reflecting the light of changing ages. Yet below, in the subterranean hush, Elizabeth's funerary parade had only just reached its resting place. The silent warden of that secret lay in the lead box, its velvet cloak a silent witness to time's relentless work. For those who know where to listen, the abbey is not merely a monument to saints and kings. It is a mausoleum of transformation, a threshold where power meets putrefaction and ambition yields to entropy. The lead coffin's legacy, sealed in purple and set in stone, remains a testament to the single truth that binds us all, no matter the glory we forge. We are destined to become the very soil beneath our own monuments. In that knowledge, we find a curious comfort. As night deepens and eyelids grow heavy, our mortal voyage, like Elizabeth's, is but the first step in a journey that continues long after the final echo of our footsteps has faded into the dark. In the year 1868, stirred by the restless curiosity of the Victorian age, Bishop Arthur Stanley decreed that the royal vault beneath Henry VII's chapel be opened once more, its contents undisturbed for 265 years. As the workmen lowered the heavy drill into the stone floor, they soon discovered that centuries of groundwater had seeped in, fatally undermining the coffins below. Each lead lid bore the scars of oxidation, flaking and crumbling under the relentless pressure of time, donning primitive breathing apparatus. The investigating party crept into what Stanley would later describe as the mortuary of monarchy, a subterranean chamber where the air was thick with ancient secrets. Before their oil lamps could fully pierce the gloom, a rancid odour engulfed them, a deep, pungent stench that pricked at every nostril. The remains of princes and duchesses, once hidden in neat rows, now lay in tragic disarray. Their coffins collapsed and mingled in a tableau of decay. Each fragment of wood and bone told a story of neglect and the inexorable grind of years. When the workers pried Mary I's coffin loose from its neighbour, they recoiled in shock at the points where the two lead shells touched. The metal had fused together, indistinguishable as separate coffins, two half-sisters, once bitter rivals in life, bound in death by the vault's crushing stillness. With careful chisels and saws, they chipped away at the fused mass, each strike echoing like a distant lament, until Elizabeth's own coffin began to emerge through the fissure, its once vibrant purple velvet now matted and rotten, clinging to the waxen corpse within. The fabric's deep hue turned to a bristling carpet of blackened mould and centuries' worth of dust. In that moment, Stanley later recorded, he felt a shiver run through his very bones, the sound of metal splintering, of wood surrendering its secret, and the low, plaintive moans of the dead filled the chamber like invisible pleas. It was then that the true nature of the vault's mystery revealed itself, not merely a repository of skeletal remains, but a sepulchre of the monarchy's final breaths, trapped and stifled beneath the stones of Westminster. Ich Exhalation, once given freely in life, had been sealed away in this darkness, only to resurface now in waves of gas and odour, testifying to the human fragility that lay beyond robes and sceptres. As the team worked by lamplight in the narrow crypt, every creaking hinge and crack in the lead lid sounded like a muted scream. The vault's walls, once a sanctuary for regal rites, now echoed with the hollow chorus of pressurized air escaping through fissures too small for sight. Apalbir, reclining against a damp pillar during a moment's respite, claimed he heard the rustle of royal garments shifting, as though the dead were turning in their sleep to whisper secrets unspoken. His companions dismissed him as overtired, the product of too many sleepless nights spent mapping the tomb's endless corridors, but his face remained pale in the flicker of torchlight. Bit by bit, Elizabeth's coffin was eased free. Its outer surface bore the weight of centuries' purple velvet, darkened to a bruise-like shade. The once velvety pile flattened where it had been pressed against Mary's own shroud. Beneath it, the blackened inner lining crackled to the touch, revealing the skeletal form within. Enrobed in the trappings of power even in death, it was as if she lay in a dream of majesty, preserved in wax and fabric, yet forever haunted by the relentless pull of entropy, despite the tragedy that permeated every corner of the vault. A solemn awe settled over the investigators. They realized that what they uncovered was not mere historical curiosity, but a living lesson in the democracy of decay. No kingly edict, no gilded tomb, No whispered promise of everlasting glory could forestall the quiet triumph of time's ceaseless march. In the hush of that crypt, amid the cracked coffins and whispered gasps of gas, the living and the dead stood equal before a fate that admits no exceptions. When the final fragment of fused lead was removed, Stanley lowered a lantern to illuminate the Queen's waxen visage one last time. Soft rays of light danced upon her still-painted features, the remnants of vermilion on cracked lips, the high cheekbones swept by shadows of age and neglect. For a fleeting instant, it was as though her spirit drifted free, surveying the scene of earthly majesty reduced to solemn ruin. Then, with careful ceremony, her coffin was returned to its niche alongside Mary's, the vault resealed with fresh layers of stone and mortar. In the months that followed, the story of the vault's opening rippled through scholarly circles, whispered over tea, and in hushed museum galleries. Yet for the clergy who tended the abbey, and for those few who had glimpsed the Queen's silent countenance in that cold chamber, the memory lingered like a half-remembered dream. They knew that beneath the abbey's hallowed floors lay more than mere bones there to remind each visitor that the gilded pageantry above could never fully conceal the humbling truth etched into every corpse that life's final breath is a testament to our shared mortality. And the sound of metal splitting was but the vault's sigh as it released those last trapped exhalations into the timeless dark. When they lifted Elizabeth's coffin from its niche, the most horrifying sight revealed itself: a viscous, black ooze, born of the embalming fluids mixing with decomposed tissue and crushed herbal spices, frankincense crystals, powdered myrrh, and finely ground wood fragments had blended with the Queen's decaying flesh to form a tar-like substance that caked thickly over splintered bone and sinew. Any remnants of soft tissue clung together like pieces of rotted rubber, a grotesque caricature of the regal body that had once stood at the helm of an empire. The investigation team recoiled, yet pressed forward, their lamps casting wavering light on the corpse's head. Where once a delicate wax and plaster mask had held a faint resemblance to Elizabeth's famed visage, now it had melted and fused with the underlying decay. Pools of sap-like resin dripped from the seams, mingling with the black sludge. The crimson wig she had worn so bright in life hung like a dying ember, its curls retaining more vibrancy than the pallid, mottled flesh beneath. Her jawbone lay detached, hinged at a jagged fracture. Still held within it were blackened teeth, blunt and stumpy, more akin to the tusks of some savage beast than the ivory smile of a monarch. Each juncture between the ostentatious preservation and the raw process of decomposition spoke of power's ruin. The coronation ring that once encircled her slender finger now lay asunder. The lead band split open, its gemless setting a parasite of metal clinging to mummified phalanges. Her gilded orb and sceptre, symbols of sovereignty, were now pockmarked with acidic pits, their polished surfaces etched by chemical reaction into a network of corroded wrinkles. At intervals, the vault's atmosphere would swell with trapped gases, prompting the embalmers to open the small vent valves to release a soft PSHT to vapor. Each hiss echoed the coffin's silent protest against its leaden confines, a final act of resistance against the artifice meant to contain it. As the investigators noted each detail with heavy lids and weary pens, the simmering truth pressed upon them. No matter how lavish the trappings, no matter the wealth spent on perfumed herbs, decay would always claw its way back. The vanity of human intervention proved fleeting in the face of nature's patient, inexorable rule. In the half-light, a solitary attendant knelt beside the coffin, gingerly scraping a sample of the black residue into a glass vial. He remarked, in a hushed tone that trembled with fatigue, that the compound felt sticky at first, but hardened quickly like pitch set to asphalt under a midday sun. It bore an odour, both sweet and acrid, the lingering perfume of myrrh, tainted by the scorched tang of rotting protein. Others collected brittle fragments of the crushed velvet lining, noting how the once soft fibres now resembled strands of charred rope, brittle and greyed by moisture and mould. One of the scholars accompanying the party, his voice thick with drowsiness, lifted a shard of plaster that had peeled from Elizabeth's face, light as a whisper, yet heavy with centuries of history. It revealed the ghostly curve of her cheekbone beneath Prussic. He traced the contour with a shaking finger, marveling that so much of a person's identity could be preserved in such fragile form. And yet, in the same breath, he shuddered at how even that ghostly likeness was corroded at the edges, its fidelity slowly eroded by acids and microbial life that thrived in the vault's stagnant gloom. The lead coffin's lid was propped open at an angle, and a thin rivulet of blackened fluid slipped out, carving a slow path across the stone floor. The team placed a metal tray beneath it, capturing each droplet as though it were a rare alchemical extract. Each drop seemed to pulse in the lamp's glow, a heartbeat of rot insisting upon its own persistence. At intervals, the investigators paused to silence the quiet hiss that rose from the fissures. A junior officer, his eyelids heavy, lifted a small oil lamp to inspect the vent valves, then carefully tightened the screw caps to delay the next exhalation. He noted in his journal, his script looping and swaying, that the coffin was less a container than a living thing, breathing in and out of its own rancid secretion. By candlelight's final flicker, they had documented every scar on the Queen's remains, the incision lines crudely sewn, the residual stains of spiced stuffing, the rusted tacks that once held her shroud in place. They had recorded the odorous profile of the embalming sludge and the microbial bloom that painted her bones in patchwork hues. And still, the black mass at the centre of it would not be fully exhausted. As the lamps dimmed and the party prepared to reseal the vault, a hush enveloped the crypt. The chief investigator, voice low and weary, uttered what all felt in their bones. We have witnessed both humanity's grandeur and its folly, entwined in this dark pilgrimage. Let us now honour the dead by returning them to their silent vigil, and leave this place to its own mercies. And so, with slow reverence, they eased Elizabeth's coffin back into its niche, straightening the torn velvet and aligning the lead panels. A final offering of crushed frankincense was cast upon the lid as it was lowered with a muted clang. The vault's lock was turned 3 times, each click ringing like a distant gong in the underground chamber. As they ascended the narrow steps, the only echoes were the soft thuds of boots and the faint residue of that PSH as the air settled. Above, the abbey's sunlit nave awaited the morning service, its beams of golden illumination oblivious to the hidden vault below. In the hush between sleep and wakefulness, the participants felt the gentle tug of slumber beckoning, their minds heavy with the solemn truths they had unearthed. Thus concluded the most dreadful chapter of Elizabeth I's posthumous saga, a testament to the poignant intersection of artifice and entropy. And as each man drifted into uneasy dreams, the sealed vault continued its slow, secret alchemy, a silent monument to the inescapable laws that govern all flesh, whether crowned or common. The preliminary analysis conducted by anatomist William Hartley unveiled a chilling phenomenon he would term recursive putrefaction. In his dimly lit laboratory, Hartley observed that the embalmed tissues did not follow the simple, linear course of decay he had expected. Instead, the sealed environment of the lead coffin, saturated with aromatic resins and heavy metals, established a cyclical set of chemical reactions. Some portions of skin and muscle ossified and mummified, drying into brittle hides, resistant to microbial invasion, while adjacent regions underwent liquefaction, dissolved into a fetid broth of proteins and lipids. Over time, pockets of semi-solid mass would reconstitute, forming strange, waxy clods that bore little resemblance to human tissue. This bizarre interplay left behind compounds of unexpected potency antimicrobial agents that, while protecting certain tissues from decomposition, seemed to accelerate the rotting of others. Hartley noted in his journal that the mummified areas retained remarkably intact structural details, veins and nerve fibers visible as dark strands beneath taut skin, whereas the liquefied zones yielded pungent effluvia, a toxic stew that resisted any attempt at chemical neutralization. He described the effect as akin to watching living and dead cells perform a morbid dance, each step choreographed by the interplay of resinous oils, vinegar washes, and the coffin's unyielding pressure. By lantern light, Hartley and his assistants filled small glass vials with samples of the putrid fluid. No sooner had they uncorked a vial for examination than the contents began to fizzle and rot anew upon contact with open air. As though reawakened by exposure, the laboratory stank of vinegary tang and acrid smoke, an odour that clung to hair and clothes long after they left the basement chambers. The room felt less like a place of science and more like an infernal crucible, where the boundaries between preservation and decay blurred into a grotesque continuum. Amid this grim spectacle, the psychological toll on Bishop Arthur Stanley and the investigative team proved profound. Stanley himself confided in his diary that he struggled to distinguish reality from fevered dreams. I hear voices in the stone, a chorus of distant sighs, and for a moment I wonder if the dead speak to me. Men who had come to document history found their senses unmoored. Several assistants reported hearing faint, indiscernible echoes, clinks of metal, flickering, as if the corpse itself were shifting beneath its lead shell. Others described a sensation of vertigo, as though the chamber's oppressive darkness had liquefied the very air around them. Eyelids grew heavy, muscles slackened, and some claimed to glimpse fleeting shapes at the edge of their vision, only to dismiss them as tricks of light and exhaustion. The bishop's own resolve frayed to the point that he swore never again to sanction the opening of a royal crypt. He penned a solemn vow in his private correspondence: "Let no future soul awaken these ancient kings, for their tombs are not repositories of knowledge, but of horror. I will not bear witness to such a blasphemy once more." From that moment on, Stanley restricted access to the vault to an inner circle of clergy, and he refused to allow any further archaeological forays beneath the abbey during his lifetime. News of the vault's unearthly revelations, however, could not be contained. When whispers reached print, the church intervened with swift censorship. Newspapers were instructed to omit all details of the unfortunate discovery, and those who had witnessed the scene were bound by oaths of silence. The Abbey's chapter issued a formal decree confining all related documents, Hartley's notes, Stanley's diaries, and the surgeon's reports to the semicircular archives for a period of 100 years. Access was to be granted only to the most senior ecclesiastics under penalty of excommunication. In the scientific community, the ramifications were immediate and far-reaching. Hartley's reports of recursive putrefaction challenged the very foundations of contemporary mortuary science. Prior methods of embalming, sprinkling dry powders, injecting arterial preservatives had assumed that a hermetically sealed coffin would uniformly arrest decay. The revelation that certain agents could conversely foster pockets of accelerated decomposition forced a wholesale re-evaluation. Medical treatises were rewritten to caution against the use of tightly confined lead chambers, recommending instead porous containers that allowed controlled exchange with the outside air. Surgeons and apothecaries convened symposia in London's lecture halls, debating the ethical and practical implications of Hartley's findings. Some proposed abandoning chemical embalming altogether in favour of rapid burial, arguing that distant interment would safely dissipate any noxious gases. Others explored novel formulas, mixtures of boric acid, charcoal, and botanical extracts to create barriers against both microbial growth and the formation of reactive compounds. The term recursive putrefaction entered medical lexicons, its ominous syllables prompting caution among the most seasoned practitioners. Yet, despite the professional shockwaves, the Abbey remained adamant in its decree. For half a century, all inquiries into the royal vault were met with polite refusal. Visitors to Westminster Abbey would marvel at the ornate chapels and the glorious stained glass, unaware that just beneath their feet lay evidence challenging centuries of mortuary orthodoxy. The hush around the subject deepened into a taboo, No one spoke of the Queen's uncanny fate, and the academic world tiptoed around the subject as if fearing to disturb something best left buried. As décades passed, the cultural impact manifested in subtle ways. Gothic revival architects incorporated motifs of decay into their designs: twisted iron balustrades, stone gargoyles with skeletal faces, crypt-like alcoves in grand drawing rooms. Literature began to feature tales of entombed monarchs whose slumber was disturbed by curious souls, their restless spirits seeping into dreams. The public, caught between fascination and dread, gravitated toward macabre phantasmagoria in theatre and burgeoning photography exhibitions, where images of mummified pharaohs and sealed vaults held equal allure. And yet, the Abbey's century-long embargo on its most dreadful secret endured. The leaded vault remained sealed, the record of recursive decay locked in chancery, and the echoes of Hartley's findings faded into whispered rumour. For those who slept within earshot of the Abbey's ancient stones, the hush was complete, save for the faint, cyclical hiss of gases exhaled from the earth below. In the deep twilight between waking and dream, one might imagine hearing the very pulse of decomposed royalty behind the thick walls, a reminder that even the greatest monarchs must bow to the inexorable cycle they once sought to conquer. Many troubling discoveries awaited beneath the Abbey's ancient stones. When soil samples were taken from the royal vault, they revealed unnerving concentrations of mercury, lead, and arsenic, so much so that the very ground itself was more a toxic waste dump than a sanctified resting place. These heavy metals, once prized for their preservative qualities, had leached into the earth over centuries, rendering the crypt a hazard zone rather than a proper sepulchre. In the light of these findings, archival documents suggest that Queen Victoria herself recoiled in horror upon reviewing a summarized report. Recognizing the public health implications, she ordered a swift reversal of traditional mortuary practices. Elaborate embalming rituals were to be abandoned in favor of rapid interment. The directive came down from Windsor, in clear terms: no more prolonged exposure of noble remains to dangerous chemicals. Henceforth, the body would be laid to rest within hours of death, shrouded only in simple linens and buried directly in the earth. The ripple effect of Victoria's decree extended well beyond royal protocol. The Gothic revival movement, then in full swing, began to incorporate new design principles that emphasized ventilation, light, and even the use of porous stone to prevent the accumulation of toxic vapors. Mausoleums and church crypts were redesigned with small air shafts to facilitate airflow. Coffins were lined with breathable fabrics rather than sealed in lead. In this way, the aesthetics of mourning so central to the Victorian era became entangled with early public health reforms. Architects drew up plans for garden cemeteries where decomposition would occur under open skies, the very antithesis of the stuffy, poison-laden vaults of old. Amid these changes, one of the most startling relics emerged near the foot of the Abbey's wall, a small crystal casket that once held Elizabeth's heart. Over time, the protein-rich tissue had undergone a dramatic transformation, fusing with embalming chemicals to form a crystalline mass, an eerie toxic jewel. When this glass container cracked, its contents oozed into the cracks of the stone floor, creating a dark, damp stain roughly 1 meter in diameter. The moisture attracted mold, and when workmen tapped the adjacent stone blocks, they swore they heard a plaintive rustle, as if the rock itself were weeping. These phenomena spelled out a harsh lesson. The royal embalming methods that were meant to immortalize had instead transmogrified the dead into repositories of hazardous materials. The very substances that sealed princes and princesses in their tombs had become long-term environmental pollutants. Choir boys rehearsing in the chapel above unwittingly practiced over a toxic stew of metals seeping silently through stone and mortar. Public health advocates seized upon these revelations to campaign for more ecologically sound funerary procedures. Newspapers began to run sensational headlines: "Royal Tomb becomes poison pit, and beneath Westminster lies a chemical hazard." Physicians warned against handling lead-lined coffins without protective gloves, and families were advised to forego elaborate latex-lined vaults in favor of biodegradable shrouds. By the turn of the 19th century, natural burial grounds, where bodies were interred in simple wicker caskets within a meadow, became a growing trend across England. Meanwhile, the abbey itself continued its silent vigil. The vault was patched with impermeable cement to contain any further leakage, and a small plaque was installed on the abbey's administrative ledger, rather than in public view to commemorate the vault's final sealing. No brass band announced the change. There was no fanfare. Instead, the abbey's custodians regarded the patchwork repair with the same whispered reverence one reserves for a sacred relic. Among the scholarly community, debates persisted about the balance between remembrance and responsibility. Some argued that to abandon elaborate rites was to dishonor the dead. Others maintained that true respect lay in preserving the living by preventing further contamination. The question became not simply one of ritual propriety, but of moral duty to future generations. Yet, even as the methodology of internment evolved, human curiosity remained undiminished. A handful of researchers petitioned for limited access to the vault for non-invasive study, geophysical imaging, air sampling, and minimal core drilling. Their hope was to chart the long-term diffusion of toxins in the abbey's foundations and to model better safeguards for other historic burial sites. These proposals were met with ambivalence. The abbey chapter balked at any intrusions, wary of reopening old wounds. After all, the vault's darkest lessons lay not only in toxicology, but in the fragile boundary between past and present. Life and decay. In the decades that followed, the principles born from Westminster's ordeal, rapid burial, breathable coffins, the avoidance of heavy metals, paved the way for modern green burial practices. Enthusiasts planted trees above biodegradable graves, and architects designed living mausoleums where visitors could wander freely and witness nature, reclaiming what the embalmers had fought so fervently to preserve. The chemical legacy of Elizabeth's tomb could never be undone, but it spurred a movement towards symbiosis with the earth rather than conquest of it. Today, when one visits the abbey, it is to marvel at soaring arches and centuries-old traditions. Few know of the buried chemical trove beneath their feet, or of the monarch whose struggle with death transformed how we care for the dying. The land above has healed, or so it appears. Flowers bloom in the cloister gardens, and bell chimes drift over Brentford Lane in the morning hush. Yet, if you listen closely in the afternoon's drowsy lull, you might catch the faintest echo of stone crying out beneath its veneer of solemn grace. A reminder that even the most sacred spaces can mask a history of quiet contamination. And so the abbey stands, a monument not only to faith and ceremony, but also to the lessons we learn in striving to delay the inevitable. Each sunlit nave and cloistered walkway bears witness to a story of transformation of dead flesh made lethal, of old toxins yielding new understanding, and of the enduring hope that we might one day lay the past to rest without risking the future. In that gentle epiphany, there lies a strange comfort, enough to coax the weariest soul toward the tender arms of sleep. Amid rows of censored sketches and diagrams, one fragment of preserved skin clinging to a scrap of tattered cloth revealed that Elizabeth's remains had become a grotesque laboratory for unprecedented biochemical reactions. Under careful scrutiny, that patch of hide bore traces of embalmer's resins, fused with the Queen's own proteins, yielding compounds never before seen in nature. It was as if her body had been both subject and reagent in an experiment that spanned centuries. In the same hidden archive lay a brittle scrap of paper inscribed in Elizabeth's own hand, "I fear not death, for it makes all men equal." The stark irony of those words now struck like a cruel prophecy. For though in life she towered above her subjects, draped in ermine and velvet, in death she found herself rendered no different from any pauper in a pauper's grave. The chemicals that had once whispered promises of permanence instead underscored the ultimate democratization of mortality. Perhaps the most haunting relic was the crystallized heart, now a glassy, inorganic jewel that glinted cruelly in the torchlight of the vault. What became of Elizabeth's vaunted declaration, "I have the heart of a king," when that heart itself had been transmuted into a toxic gem? The phrase that once inspired loyal verses in the court's poets now rang hollow, its bravado undercut by the sight of the Queen's own muscle, rigid and crystalline, no longer beating but preserved in deadly stillness. One might ask, would her stirring speeches, her triumphant martial parades, hold any sway over the knowledge of that inert relic? The resounding lesson of this grim discovery lay not in defiance of death, but in the fleeting nature of glory and the unyielding equity of the grave. Beneath Westminster Abbey, the lead coffin rests in utter silence. In its enveloping darkness, one can imagine the spirit of Gloriana, once untouchable in life, now constrained by the unbending laws of chemistry and time. She who once forged alliances and issued decrees from her ivory throne now lies still, the sovereign of decay rather than dominion. Yet this knowledge of recursive decomposition, of mummification, giving way to liquefaction, and back again will journey forth with the millions who wander through the Abbey's sunlit aisles. Each visitor departs not only with memories of vaulted ceilings and stained glass, but also with a subtle disquiet, a whispered reminder that no crown can defy the passage of years. Outside the Abbey's doors, life unfolds in perennial rhythms. Schoolchildren tiptoe by guided tours, and the chimes of Big Ben mark the hour. Yet underfoot, beneath flags fluttering in the breeze and beneath the feet of those oblivious travellers, lies a vault where time's patient verdict continues to sound, the residue of acids, the echo of gas escaping through tiny fissures, the lingering hum of biochemical cycles, all testify that the Queen's body remains engaged in its eternal transformation. And so the edges of our awareness blur between the grandeur of history and the quiet hum of science, a hum that beckons one's eyelids to droop, as though the very memory of this subterranean alchemy coaxed the mind toward drowsy contemplation. It is a profound kind of peace to accept this fate, to recognize that every monarch and every commoner must alike surrender to decomposition's gentle tyranny. In that shared destiny lies a certain comfort, a lullaby that beckons even the wakeful to yield to slumber. For what is sleep but a temporary embrace of that same dissolution, a nightly surrender to forces beyond our control? As you close your eyes, the echo of metal sighing in a distant vault may slip into your dreams, reminding you that in rest, all distinctions fade. So let the Abbey's vault be both monument and warning that no fortress of brass or tapestry of silk can hold back the slow, soft collapse of flesh. And yet, in that collapse, there is a quiet dignity, an assurance that we are all woven into the tapestry of nature's endless cycles. Each breath we take, each step we make, carries us closer to that gentle unraveling. But until our own coffins are sealed, we live in the sunlight above these hallowed stones, cherishing each fragile moment between birth and rest. May this story, then, serve as a lull that is both somber and sweet, a reminder that vestiges of power are transient, but the deep, abiding kinship of decay connects us all. In the patience of time's descent, in the soft hiss of gases trapped in lead, we find the final equality that Elizabeth herself foresaw, an equality that unfolds not in the capitals of empires, but in the silent, sacred darkness beneath them. And as you drift into sleep, let the Abbey's secret murmur in your ear that every crown, every triumph, every whispered vow of immortality will one day return to dust. And in that return, there lies the most universal comfort of all. The scientific examinations that followed the opening of Elizabeth's coffin confirmed what Hartley had first dubbed recursive putrefaction. Under the combined influence of embalming chemicals and the coffin's hermetic pressure, flesh repeatedly fragmented and then recrystallized into strange new compounds. Each morsel of tissue told its own story: putrid, oily slurries of fat bound with powdered incense, bone fragments coated in plaster, like matrices, rotted velvet strips wrapped tight around decayed remnants. Every biopsy sample revealed chemical reactions never before recorded in human remains. Curious antibacterial agents forming alongside accelerants of decay. A grotesque cycle of preservation and dissolution. Bishop Stanley's faith in the vault's sanctity was shattered. He later confessed that the air within the crypt produced a disorienting vertigo, as though one were wading through a mire of memories. He recounted the interminable groans of metal, the damp, subterranean moan that he likened to the cries of corpses, long undone. These sounds, he admitted with quivering voice, haunted him day and night, eroding his courage and replacing it with dread. In his final years, Stanley withdrew entirely from matters concerning royal tombs. He insisted on a simple requiem for himself. No vault. No marble sarcophagus. No ornate seal. Let me rest in soil, he wrote, with no one to disturb my dissenting silence. In the centuries that followed, the vault's records were sealed away. Hartley's laboratory notes, Stanley's trembling diary entries, the surgeon's morgue logs, all locked in a small collection, accessible only to the highest ecclesiastical authorities. For the duration of the Victorian era, the nobility regarded these secrets as a stain upon the monarchy's dignity, a reminder that royal flesh bled and stank like any other. The protocols of death were overturned, embalming times were slashed, aromatic chemicals were limited or banned, and rapid burial became the norm. Where once elaborate mortuary showmanship had signalled power, families now chose speed and simplicity. Entombment in breathable shrouds. Earth held as a friend rather than an adversary. In Westminster and beyond, whispering corridors spoke of the great reversal, a cultural pivot from the grand to the modest. Funeral processions moved at twilight. The scent of frankincense, replaced by that of cut flowers and damp soil. Coffins were crafted of untreated wood, designed to decompose as naturally as the bodies they carried. Society, once obsessed with preserving outward form, embraced the inevitability of transformation, acknowledging that decay itself is a rite of passage. For those first few years, the changes felt radical, monuments forgotten in the attic, mausoleums half-built and then abandoned. Yet, in their stead, new traditions emerged, planting memorial trees above fresh graves, weaving biodegradable wreaths from local herbs. The heart jar, once prized as a royal relic, was interred in common cemeteries alongside humble pottery vessels. The Queen's crystallized heart, that toxic gem, was entombed in lead-lined archives, far from public view, a silent testament to the cost of perceived immortality. Meanwhile, the Abbey's grand vault, now sealed for all but the most arcane purposes, came to symbolize a hard-earned lesson that no matter one's rank, all bodies return to dust in due course. The stones above grew mossy, their surfaces etched by rain, and the hush around the crypt deepened into a respectful murmur. Occasionally, scholars would petition for non-invasive studies, ground-penetrating radar, careful sampling of air for residual gases, but most inquiries were politely declined. The Abbey chapter upheld Stanley's decree, let the dead sleep, and let their secrets slumber with them. Even so, the vault's legacy endured in the practices of modern mortuary science. Embalmers drew upon Hartley's findings to develop closed-loop systems that minimized chemical loss, and they experimented with plant-based preservatives that left the soil untainted. Green cemeteries, where bodies are laid in earthen niches beneath wildflowers, became popular across Britain, echoing the Abbey's return to modest interment. Legislation eventually mandated the reduction of heavy metals in burial goods, and professional associations issued guidelines instructing families on environmentally sound funeral options. In quieter corners of the Abbey's library, a few surviving fragments of Stanley's journals lay cradled in velvet cases, passages too unnerving to print, recorded in ink that trembled with fear. A single page bore his italic script. I have witnessed the dissolving of crowns, the crumbling of kings beneath the weight of their own vanity. Next to it lay Hartley's meticulous chemical charts. Each column a ledger of decomposition's many faces. Yet, to a génération past, the Victorian tumult receded into obscurity. Tourists marvelled at the Abbey's soaring nave and its resplendent stained glass, unaware of the subterranean revolution that had reshaped society's approach to death. Guardians of memory ensured that only sanitized histories reached the layman's eye, polishing the narrative of Tudor glory while keeping the darker truths locked away. The leaden vault remained a footnote, a cautionary tale shared in hushed tones by a handful of specialists. And so, the vault slumbered on, its air now stale, but free of the worst toxins, sealed with new mortar and layers of protective brick. The cycles of recursive putrefaction, extinguished by modern science and swift burial, the crypt became an echo chamber for footsteps rather than gasps. In the Abbey's twilight hush, one might hear only the distant tolling of bells and the soft shuffle of pilgrims' sandals. In the end, the tale of Elizabeth's posthumous odyssey served as both warning and lullaby. It spoke of the futility of resisting change, the folly of believing that human hands could forever forestall nature's inexorable decree, and as sleep beckons with gentle arms, that murmur lingers, however we adorn our passing. Time will guide us home, each of us, crowned or common, draped in velvet or wrapped in simple linen, steps toward the same quiet transformation, one that needs no ceremony, only the patient embrace of the earth. In that shared destiny, there is a profound peace, lulling the weary mind into dreams of gentle rest and final release. Surveys of soil surrounding Westminster Abbey's royal vault revealed alarming concentrations of heavy metals lead to mercury and arsenic, clocking in at levels many times above today's safety thresholds. The once sacred ground had turned into a veritable toxic pond, as chemical residues from centuries-old embalming seeped into the porous limestone and mingled with charred bone fragments. Each scoop of earth yielded a dark, damp sample that exuded a faint, acrid tang, a blend of musty decay and medicinal sourness, like vinegar steeped in rust. For the masons tasked with maintaining the Abbey's foundations, every strike of the hammer released a plume of putrid perfume, part floral incense, part acrid rot, making even the simplest repair a health hazard. Perhaps the most unsettling relic of this buried alchemy was a small crystal casket that once housed Elizabeth's heart. Over time, the organ's protein matrix had fused with the toxic embalming compounds to form what researchers dubbed the poison jewel. This crystalline heart, smooth to the touch yet ominously cold, stood as a monument to the Queen's own boast. "I have the heart of a king, now crystallized into a hollow, inert gem laced with lethal material." Legend held that anyone who gazed upon it too long felt a creeping unease, as if the stone itself exhaled quiet malice. Surrounding this heart jar, shards of tar-like resin, threads of decayed velvet, and splintered bone littered the floor, transforming the vault into a strange convergence of necropolis and mineral deposit. These revelations sent tremors through archaeological and forensic circles alike, forcing a reckoning with the environmental legacy of royal burial practices. No longer could tombs be viewed solely as cultural artifacts. They had become toxic waste sites, repositories of ancient contamination that threatened modern workers and visitors. Museums and heritage organizations found themselves scrambling to draft new guidelines, ground-penetrating radar surveys before excavation, protective gear for any who ventured below, and stringent protocols for disposing of contaminated earth. In some cases, entire excavation plans were shelved when toxicity reports came back red-lined. Her Majesty's government, jolted by these findings, moved swiftly to amend heritage legislation. Sites of known or suspected royal interment were to be treated as hazardous zones, subject to environmental impact assessments akin to those for industrial facilities. Special permits would be required to dredge or drill, and comprehensive remediation strategies, such as soil washing, metal chelation, and phytoremediation were mandated before any public access could resume. Archaeological charters were rewritten to emphasize ecological responsibility alongside historical preservation, marking a paradigm shift in how society approached the dead. Meanwhile, scholars debated the broader implications of these toxic tombs. Some argued that the case of Westminster Abbey was an isolated anomaly, the dark side of Tudor excess. Others warned that similar contamination likely lay beneath countless imperial mausoleums, dynastic crypts, and cathedral burials worldwide. The global heritage community began to share data, cross-referencing burial protocols with local soil analyses, uncovering patterns of heavy metal hotspots wherever lavish embalming had once prevailed. In a matter of years, a new subfield emerged: necrotoxicology, the study of how remains and burial rites contribute to long-term environmental hazards. In parallel, conservationists found themselves grappling with a delicate moral balance. On one hand, the lessons of Elizabeth's vault compelled more humane and ecologically sound burial customs, quick interment, minimal chemical use, natural decomposition. On the other hand, the desire to study and commemorate the past remained a powerful motivator. As a compromise, some institutions began to employ remote sensing technologies, non-invasive imaging, chemical sniffers, and airborne drones, allowing researchers to peer into tombs without disturbing a single layer of soil. This approach, though less dramatic than prying open a coffin, offered a safer path forward. In cathedral towns and village churchyards alike, local authorities took note. Parish councils enacted bylaws limiting the use of embalming fluids, and funeral directors began offering green packages that emphasized biodegradable shrouds and wooden coffins free of preservatives. The public, once enamored of ornate funerals and embossed lead caskets, grew more receptive to the idea of returning bodies to the earth with minimal fanfare. Eco-conscious burial parks sprang up on former estate lands, their grassy mounds and wildflower glades, a stark contrast to the Victorian era's sombre catacombs. Yet even as these modern innovations took hold, the memory of the Abbey's toxic vault lingered like a half-forgotten lullaby, a cautionary tale whispered in the twilight halls of heritage conservation. Visitors strolling the cloister gardens on a sunny afternoon might pause, just for a moment, at the thought that beneath their feet lay centuries of chemical stew, that the ground itself had borne witness to both regal pomp and silent pollution. In that gentle unease, they felt a kinship with the archaeologists in their gas masks, the forensic teams in protective suits, a shared realization that the dead speak not only of history, but of our responsibility to the living world. And so the Abbey's buried chemistry shaped a new era of environmental mindfulness. Preservationists learned that to honor the past, one must not poison the future. The story of heavy metals drenching ancient limestone became a parable for all cultural heritage, that every monument, no matter how grand, casts a shadow that extends beyond the stone. As evening mists drifted across the old stones, and the sound of distant bells lulled the city to rest, one could almost hear the soft hiss of groundwater trickling through crypts, carrying with it the legacy of embalming's hidden toll. It was a whisper both ancient and urgent that our care for the dead is inseparable from our care for the earth, and that in the end, all will return to dust, and we must strive to make that dust a cradle, not a curse. The opening of Elizabeth's tomb reverberated through the centuries, transforming the way generations to come regarded death, no longer a stage for ornate legend, but a tableau of repulsive tragedy. Once, poets had celebrated her as a luminous emblem of virtue. Now, writers and artists seized upon the image of a hollowed halo to craft a new genre of historical horror. In smoky Victorian parlours, Gothic novelists penned tales of monarchs whose waxen faces melted into mouldering flesh, lending birth to narratives that blended documented fact with pale nightmares. Sketches circulated among illicit art circles, depicting the Queen's corpse as though morphing before one's eyes, the once smooth wax mask distorted into grotesque ridges. Crimson locks splayed across a decayed visage like cursed ribbons. Painters of the Gothic revival, already drawn to shadowy arches and gargoylish forms, found fresh inspiration in the Queen's posthumous metamorphosis. Their canvases, usually reserved for brooding abbeys and moonlit cloisters, now featured vignettes of the melting regalia. One particularly chilling series showed the red wig, eyes still intact beneath a blanched forehead, shedding strands that drifted onto cracked tile floors. Exhibitions in Paris and London, though officially sanctioned, often displayed warnings. Visitors were urged to look only at the more stylized works, and certain illustrations bore discreet notices of photography prohibited to prevent the public's unwanted exposure to the grim reality. In England's oral tradition, the tale of the lead queen's ghost became a staple of All Hallows' Eve. Grandmothers, tucking their stories into the firelight, would whisper of travellers who claimed, upon passing Westminster at midnight, to hear soft PSHT sounds the size of lead and decay echoing through the cold stones. Some swore they glimpsed a pale figure in Tudor finery drifting along the cloister's arches, only to vanish when the church bells tolled. These whispered legends served as a sober reminder that no mortal station could escape the equalizing grip of decomposition. Music, too, felt the shift. Funeral rites, once heralded by stately organ chords and measured chorales, evolved to capture the darker timbre of mortality. Embalmers' assistants turned composers, introduced mournful antiphons that mimicked the wind's moan through crypt vents, layering low bass drones with sudden, sharp sibilant notes, an audible PSHT, woven like a percussive heartbeat. Choirs trained in candlelit chapels performed these requiems, their voices rising in staggered waves to evoke the ebb and flow of life slipping away. A popular liturgical hymn included the line, "When the ember's breath is spent, the wax and bone shall blend." Its melody, both haunting and lullingly repetitive, lulling congregations into reflective somnolence. Clergy who conducted state funerals adapted their music to include these sombre innovations. At the tomb of the Duke of Marlborough, for example, the choir sang a dirge under stained-glass windows, each syllable elongated to mirror the slow drip of embalming resin. Metal Latin phrases about Hasta corpus dissolvitur were intoned in echoing passages, calling to mind the chemical alchemy unfolding beneath the abbey's floor. As the final note faded, mourners felt the weight of centuries settle upon their shoulders, the melody hanging in the still air like a final breath. Even architectural spaces transformed in response to this collective unease. Some Gothic revival chapels installed tinted glass cocoons around vault entrances, their panels etched with warnings about preserving dignity through restraint. These edicts, though unspoken, suggested that to witness too much of death's raw mechanics was to risk contaminating the sanctity of remembrance. Beneath vaulted ceilings and between clustered columns, visitors walked with lowered eyes, conscious of the unspoken promise that horror would remain just beyond sight. And yet, for every hushed prohibition, there was an undercurrent of fascination. Secret societies of antiquarians traded clandestine photographs, ghostly exposures of coffin, hinges, or velvet folds, carefully concealed in pocket albums. They convened in candlelit back rooms to compare notes on the shifting composition of the embalming sludge, arguing over its forensic significance as though deciphering a royal cipher. These meetings, though unofficial, kept alive the memory of what lay beneath the surface of amber-hued reverence. In the broader tapestry of European culture, composers and librettists wove Elizabeth's post-mortem tale into operatic scenes. Choruses in black robes would lament her fate beneath painted backdrops of crumbling castles, the orchestra underscoring each sob with tremolo strings and tolling bells. At the opera's end, audiences often sat in stunned silence, their eyes heavy, their minds wandering between the realms of myth and memory. Through all these iterations, literature, painting, folklore, music, and architecture. The opening of that fateful tomb in Westminster Abbey remained a touchstone for the inexorable shift from luminous myth to visceral tragedy. It was a moment when death ceased to be the cloaked figure at society's edges, and instead became a living, breathing force demanding recognition. And as each new generation encountered the story, in whatever form it took, they too found themselves drawn into a somnolent contemplation of mortality. Perhaps that is the greatest legacy of Elizabeth's vault. It reminds us that beneath every layer of pomp and ceremony lies the same silent work of dissolution. In the hush that follows a requiem's last chord, in the candle's guttering glow, in the soft echo of a shuttered crypt, we hear the same truth whispered that no halo, however golden, can remain untouched by time's encroaching hand. And so, in that drowsy awareness, we yield to the gentle pull of night, comforted by the knowledge that we join a centuries-old procession toward rest, each of us, like Elizabeth herself, destined to become part of the grand, slumbering tapestry of the earth. Elizabeth once declared, "I may be weak of body, but I possess the heart and stomach of a king." Yet within her sealed lead coffin, that vaunted immortality wrought by oils, resins, and salts proved fleeting, a mere postponement, before her corpse was thrust into a cycle of cryptic decomposition and rebirth. The very chemicals intended to preserve her became catalysts of change, dragging royal flesh into the churn of decay and recrystallization. In that tomb, the veneer of greatness dissolved, revealing the hollow core of power's illusions. This revelation stripped away the secrecy of royal funeral rites, laying bare what had once been cloaked in ceremony and reverence. Society was forced to contemplate a sobering truth, no matter how fervently one strives, no matter how sumptuous the crown. Time and unfeeling chemistry can grind all pretensions to dust. The dissolution of monarchy became the ultimate proof of what some called death's democracy, a state in which all classes, from sovereign to serf, stand equal in the earth's embrace. Fragments of Elizabeth's embalming experiments and the grim records of her vault found their way into diverse fields of study. Anthropologists examined bone and tissue samples to trace patterns of chemical alteration. Architects studied the abbey's damp stones to understand how structural design could either exacerbate or mitigate subterranean decay. Psychologists explored the collective horror that arose when a nation faced its own mortality so intimately. Theologians pondered the paradox of a queen's promise of eternal reign, undone by the inexorable laws of nature. Each interdisciplinary symposium concluded with the same lesson: fame is transient, and the meaning of life lies in living wisely enough to face one's own dissolution without regret. Conservators and museum curators, unsettled by the abbey's hidden chemistry, began to revise preservation standards. The 13th century reliquary that once held relics of saints was re-evaluated for its lead lining. The vaulted crypts of cathedrals were audited for ventilation deficiencies that might trap toxic gases. In lecture halls across Europe, aspiring mortuary scientists learned of Elizabeth's case as a cautionary tale, how the most elaborate preparations could backfire when subject to centuries of secrecy and silence. Meanwhile, popular culture absorbed the vault's legacy. In scholarly journals, titles like Regal Rot a Study in Hobbesian Equality challenged readers to accept that memento mori applies even to emblems of supreme authority. Biographies of Elizabeth I now included final chapters on her posthumous journey, illustrating the full arc of her power, from triumphant reign to chemical crucible. In quiet pubs near university towns, doctoral candidates debated whether to focus on the theology of decay or the environmental ethics of burial. The awareness of mortality's universal reach inspired new artistic expressions. Poets composed elegies that juxtaposed Elizabeth's glittering court with the black sludge of her vault. One verse read, "She wore the lion's crown in life, but lay in tar and resin tamed. In death, no crown could stay her close. And turned flesh is all we claim." Painters, too, experimented with texture layering gesso mixed with powdered resin to create canvases that cracked and bubbled. Mimicking the archival records of recursive putrefaction, galleries displayed these pieces under dim, golden lights, inviting viewers to peer into the fine lines of fissure as though they were looking into a 19th century crypt. Amid this scholarly and creative fervour, a gentle shift occurred in public life. Funeral customs grew simpler, yet more heartfelt. People spoke openly of their wishes for minimal rites, opting for gardens planted in memory of loved ones rather than monumental mausoleums. Charities offered programs to educate families about eco-friendly burials, emphasizing that natural return to the soil can be an act of remembrance rather than neglect. The green burial movement, though nascent, gained traction as a practical acknowledgement of the lessons learned beneath the Abbey's venerable stones. In religious communities, sermons took on a reflective note, urging congregations to consider life's fleeting nature. Clergy quoted, "Elizabeth's own maxim, death makes us all equal, not as a lament but as an invitation to live with purpose." Memorial services wove in readings from centuries past, balanced by modern calls to stewardship, caring for the environment as caretakers of both living and dead. Educational curricula even embraced the Abbey's cautionary chronicle. History courses integrated chapters on the interplay of chemistry and ceremony. Chemistry classes examined Hartley's samples under microscopes, identifying unexpected antibacterial compounds. Literature classes dissected the Gothic stories that emerged in Elizabeth's wake, tracing the motif of decay from Shelley's poems to contemporary horror fiction. In the hush of evening, when the world grows still and eyelids flutter heavy, one might reflect on the paradox of Elizabeth's journey. She who once stood at the pinnacle of power, shielded by myth and majesty, became a silent teacher of humility in death. Hairfold, sealed for centuries, spoke a universal whisper: none can outlast time's patient decree. And so, as slumber beckons with soft hands, consider this: every breath we draw, every ambition we chase, carries us closer to that same stillness. Yet, within that inevitability lies a canvas for meaning. If we choose to live with honesty, aware that our flesh will one day surrender to the earth, we may find a curious solace not in gilded promises of forever, but in the fleeting beauty of each passing moment. Let that thought guide you like a gentle lullaby, a reminder that our shared destiny need not fill us with dread, but rather with the quiet resolve to leave a legacy of kindness and wisdom. For in the end, we all become part of the great tapestry of return, each of us adding a thread to the endless cycle of life, death, and rebirth, underneath vaults both humble and grand. The story of the exploration of Queen Elizabeth I's lead coffin is a profound reminder of the fleeting nature of fame and power. Through this video, we realize that no matter how many perfumes, cements, or layers of lead stand between us and the earth, the flesh must eventually return to dust. Even the most splendid authority is only temporary before the inexorable forces of time and chemistry. The greatest value this story offers is the absolute equality of death. From kings and queens to commoners, all undergo the same process. All are buried beneath the soil and become part of nature. The democracy of death is not merely a philosophical concept, but an undeniable biological reality. Furthermore, the video highlights lessons in environmental and community responsibility. Continuing to use embalming methods that rely on heavy toxins not only causes hidden pollution but also threatens human health and degrades cultural heritage. We must reconsider funeral customs in a sustainable direction, favoring rapid burial, reducing chemical use, and developing green burial practices that are environmentally friendly. Ultimately, this video is a call to live each moment to the fullest, knowing that no crown can endure forever. Every second of our existence is precious. Let us cherish our health, love those around us, and leave a positive legacy, rather than striving to build an illusory glory. In the silent moment before the lead coffin, we learn that the most beautiful life is an authentic one that accepts the cycle of nature and maintains a peaceful heart amid change.